I'm not gonna lie to you, I would go to sleep at night, I would have 15 pills sitting on the desk next to me for when I wake up because I knew I was gonna have withdrawal when I got up.
Kurt Angle took 65 extra-strength Vicodin every single day. That's enough to kill most people multiple times over. He is an Olympic hero turned wrestling superstar turned addict with one sister dead from overdose. But it wasn't just the drugs. There was something much darker behind his downfall: the descent into darkness. In the world of professional wrestling, few names command as much respect and admiration as Kurt Angle, an Olympic gold medalist who transitioned into one of the most decorated professional wrestlers of all time. Angle's career was nothing short of legendary, but behind the championship belts, the roaring crowds, and the seemingly invincible persona stood a man fighting a battle far more dangerous than any opponent he ever faced in the ring. This is the tragic story of how Kurt Angle's greatest enemy wasn't Brock Lesnar, The Rock, or Stone Cold Steve Austin. It was himself. Kurt Angle's descent into what would become one of the darkest chapters of his life began with something that millions of athletes face: injury. But this wasn't just any injury. When you're a professional wrestler performing night after night, putting your body through unimaginable punishment, injuries aren't just occupational hazards, they're inevitabilities. And for Kurt Angle, the injury that would change everything came when he broke his neck for the second time during his tenure with World Wrestling Entertainment. Now, imagine for a moment the excruciating reality of breaking your neck, not once, but twice. The human neck is one of the most vulnerable parts of our anatomy, housing the spinal cord that controls virtually every function of our body. Breaking it once would be enough to end most people's careers, if not their ability to walk. But Kurt Angle, he broke his neck and kept wrestling. He broke it again and still continued to perform. This wasn't courage. This was the beginning of a nightmare that would consume him for years to come.
After I broke my neck the second time, the first time in WWE, I was introduced to painkillers, and when I started taking them, I really liked it. I mean, it masked the pain. I couldn't feel the pain.
It was after that second neck break that Kurt Angle was introduced to the pharmaceutical demon that would nearly destroy his life: painkillers. Specifically, he was prescribed extra-strength Vicodin, a potent opioid medication that, when used as directed, can provide legitimate pain relief for those suffering from severe injuries. When used improperly, however, it can become a gateway to addiction, dependency, and in far too many cases, death. At first, Kurt followed the rules. He took one pill every 4 to 6 hours, exactly as his doctors had instructed. The effect was almost miraculous. The debilitating pain that had been his constant companion, pain that would have forced most people into retirement, simply melted away. But the medication did something else too, something that Kurt found particularly appealing given his demanding schedule and the physical toll of performing night after night for WWE.
It kind of gave me an energetic feel. It didn't make me feel nauseous like it does a lot of people. And I started taking it.
This is where Kurt Angle's story takes on a particularly insidious dimension. Unlike many people who experience negative side effects from opioid medications, nausea, dizziness, mental fog, Kurt's body seemed to respond positively. The drugs didn't just mask his pain, they gave him energy. They made him feel, paradoxically, more capable of performing at the highest level. For a professional athlete whose entire identity and livelihood depended on physical performance, this seemed like a miracle solution. It wasn't. It was a trap. What Kurt Angle didn't realize, what most people don't realize when they first start down this path, is that opioid medications like Vicodin are designed to be used temporarily. The human body is remarkably adaptable, and one of its less helpful adaptations is the development of tolerance to opioid drugs. Simply put, the more you take them, the more you need to achieve the same effect. What starts as one pill every 4 to 6 hours doesn't stay that way for long.
But after a while, you build a tolerance and one doesn't work anymore. Then you have to take 2, and 2 led to 4, 4 led to 8.
This is the insidious mathematics of addiction. It's not a linear progression, it's exponential. 1 pill becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, and before you know it, you're taking amounts that would have seemed unthinkable when you first started. For Kurt Angle, this escalation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. He'd take an extra pill when the pain was particularly bad. Then he'd take an extra pill to maintain his energy during a grueling travel travel schedule. Then he'd take extra pills simply because his body was demanding them, screaming for them, dependent on them in a way that transcended pain management entirely. The numbers in Kurt Angle's case are genuinely staggering and terrifying. When most people hear about prescription painkiller addiction, they might imagine someone taking 10 or 15 pills a day, already a dangerous and potentially lethal amount. But Kurt Angle's addiction spiraled far beyond even those frightening numbers.
But I was taking 65 extra strength Vicodin a day.
65 pills a day. To put that in perspective, taking just 10 extra strength Vicodin in a single day could cause severe liver damage due to the acetaminophen content in the medication. Taking 65 should have killed him multiple times over. The fact that Kurt Angle survived this level of consumption speaks not to the safety of the medication, but to what can only be described as an extraordinary physiological tolerance built up over time and, quite frankly, sheer luck. This wasn't recreational drug use. This wasn't someone taking pills to get high or to party. This was a man whose body had become so dependent on these medications that he required these astronomical doses just to function, just to avoid the crippling symptoms of withdrawal that would set in if he went too long without them. Kurt Angle had become a prisoner in his own body, shackled by a chemical dependency that controlled every aspect of his life. And here's where the situation becomes even more complex and tragic. Kurt Angle was trying desperately to hide his addiction from WWE, from his colleagues, from the world. But when you're consuming 65 pills a day, when you're passing out from the effects of the medication, when your entire existence revolves around maintaining your supply, people notice. The company knew, his friends knew. But in the world of professional wrestling, where performers are expected to work through injuries that would sideline athletes in any other sport, where the show must always go on regardless of personal cost, Kurt's addiction was an open secret that everyone saw, but few felt empowered to address. The psychological burden of living with this secret, of maintaining the facade of the indomitable Kurt Angle while privately battling an addiction that was consuming him from the inside out, was enormous. Every day became an exercise in deception, not just deceiving others, but deceiving himself about the severity of his situation, about his ability to control it, about whether he even wanted to stop. Because that's another insidious aspect of opioid addiction. The drugs become so interwoven with your ability to function, with your sense of normalcy, that the idea of stopping, of facing life without them, becomes more terrifying than continuing down the path of self-destruction. For Kurt Angle, those pills weren't just managing pain anymore. They were managing his anxiety, his stress, his grief, his fear. They had become his psychological crutch for dealing with every challenge life threw at him, and life was about to throw him a challenge that would push him to the absolute brink. The death of his sister from a heroin overdose, an event that would trigger one of the darkest moments in Kurt Angle's entire life and reveal just how deeply his addiction had taken hold. The night, everything almost ended. The phone call came at the worst possible time. Though really, is there ever a good time to receive news that your sibling has died? Kurt Angle was at a house show, one of WWE's untelevised events that nonetheless form the backbone of a wrestler's grueling schedule. These shows might not make it to television, but they're no less demanding, no less physically punishing than the events that do. And for Kurt, the next day held something even more significant, an Iron Man match with Brock Lesnar on SmackDown. For those unfamiliar with professional wrestling, an Iron Man match is exactly what it sounds like, a test of endurance, stamina, and resilience. These matches can last an hour or more, with the winner being determined by who scores the most pinfalls or submissions within that time limit. It's one of the most prestigious match types in professional wrestling, reserved for only the most elite performers. This was supposed to be the biggest match of Kurt Angle's career up to that point. Instead, it became the backdrop for one of the most devastating moments of his life.
And my brother calls me and says, hey, your sister just died of a heroin overdose.
Kurt's sister was only 40 years old. 40, an age when most people are still in the prime of their lives, when they still have decades of experiences, relationships, and memories ahead of them. But heroin, like all opioid drugs, doesn't care about potential or promise. It doesn't care about families torn apart or futures stolen. It simply takes and takes and takes until there's nothing left to give.
And it crushed me. I mean, I was crying. I was in such pain thinking about my sister, who was only 40 years old, dying from a heroin overdose.
But there was another layer to Kurt's grief, another dimension that made this tragedy even more unbearable: guilt. 8 months prior to her death, Kurt had made a difficult decision. Watching his sister struggle with her heroin addiction, seeing her spiral deeper and deeper into drug dependency, Kurt had given her an ultimatum. It was the kind of tough love that addiction counselors often recommend, the kind of boundary setting that's supposed to help motivate addicts to seek treatment. He told her that if she didn't get clean, he wouldn't speak to her anymore. Now, imagine the crushing weight of that guilt. Your sister dies, and the last interaction you had with her was essentially an ultimatum. You spent 8 months not speaking to her, hoping that your absence would somehow shock her into sobriety, into choosing recovery over her addiction. And then she dies anyway, and you never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell her you loved her one more time. Never got to hear her voice or see her smile again. The what-ifs and if-onlys in a situation like that don't just haunt you, they consume you entirely. Kurt Angle was in a hotel room, processing the worst news of his life, grappling with grief and guilt in equal measure. And sitting right there, next to him, was his own demon, his bottle of Vicodin. The same class of drugs, opioids, that had just killed his sister, were the very drugs he was addicted to himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. The similarity between his sister's heroin addiction and his own prescription pill addiction wasn't lost on him. In that moment, he was staring at the pharmaceutical version of what had just killed his sibling. And what did Kurt Angle do? He made a decision that nearly ended his life. 20 pills, all at once. Not taken over the course of hours or a day, but consumed in a single moment, chewed up and swallowed in what could be interpreted as either a desperate attempt to numb unbearable pain or a subconscious suicide attempt. Whether Kurt fully intended to end his life at that moment is something perhaps only he knows. But the outcome could easily have been fatal. Taking 20 Vicodin at once, even with a tolerance built up from chronic use, is Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the chamber instead of 1. Kurt didn't wake up until 5 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. He had essentially been unconscious for close to 24 hours, his body overwhelmed by the massive dose of opioids flooding his system. During this time, WWE was desperately trying to reach him. They knew about his sister's death. His brother had presumably informed them as well. They wanted to give him permission to skip the match, to go home, to grieve, to be with his family, and plan his sister's funeral. Kurt was supposed to be at the arena at 1 p.m. He didn't arrive until 5:30 p.m. For a professional wrestling show, that's cutting it incredibly close. SmackDown would have been starting soon, and here was one of the main event wrestlers, someone scheduled for the biggest match of the night, showing up just hours before showtime. But show up he did, still reeling from the emotional trauma of his sister's death, still recovering from the massive overdose he'd taken the night before, still carrying the weight of guilt and grief that would have broken most people. This is where we see the complexity of Kurt Angle's character and the complicated relationship he had with both his profession and his addiction. In his grief-stricken state, he convinced himself that wrestling that night, performing in front of thousands of people, going through with the Iron Man match against Brock Lesnar, was what his sister would have wanted. Perhaps it was. Perhaps his sister would have wanted him to honor his commitments, to find solace in doing what he loved. Or perhaps this was the rationalization of an addict, someone who had become so accustomed to pushing through pain and adversity with chemical assistance that even the death of a loved one wasn't enough to make him stop. Here, we see the other reason Kurt wrestled that night: escape. For 1 hour in that ring, wrestling Brock Lesnar, he wouldn't have to think about his sister. He wouldn't have to feel the crushing weight of her loss. He wouldn't have to confront the guilt of their 8-month estrangement or the horror of how her life had ended. The wrestling ring, ironically, became a sanctuary from his pain, a place where he could focus entirely on the physical, the tactical, the performance, and temporarily forget the emotional devastation threatening to overwhelm him. And in perhaps the cruelest twist of all, he delivered one of the best performances of his career. The crowd had no idea what he was going through. They had no idea that the man in the ring had nearly killed himself with an overdose the night before. They had no idea his sister had just died. They just saw Kurt Angle, the Olympic gold medalist, the wrestling machine, performing at an extraordinarily high level. And he was praised for it, celebrated for it, rewarded for it with cheers and accolades. But recognition and recovery are two very different things. Kurt Angle's battle with addiction was far from over. In fact, it was about to get significantly worse. Rock bottom and the road to redemption After his sister's death and the harrowing experience of nearly overdosing himself, you might think Kurt Angle would have recognized the severity of his situation and sought help immediately. But addiction doesn't work that way. The human capacity for denial, for rationalization, for convincing ourselves that we have things under control even when we manifestly don't, is extraordinary. And for Kurt Angle, his journey through the depths of addiction was just beginning. WWE, recognizing the severity of Kurt's substance abuse issues, eventually presented him with an ultimatum of their own: go to rehabilitation or leave the company. For most people, this would have been a wake-up call, a clear signal that professional intervention was not just recommended but necessary. But Kurt wasn't ready. He couldn't accept that he needed help, or perhaps more accurately, he wasn't willing to accept the vulnerability and perceived weakness that came with admitting his need for help. So instead of accepting help, Kurt Angle left WWE and signed with another wrestling promotion, Impact Wrestling, formerly known as TNA, Total Nonstop Action. This move, while continuing his wrestling career, did nothing to address the underlying addiction that was destroying his life. If anything, the change of scenery simply provided new opportunities for his substance abuse to evolve and worsen. At Impact Wrestling, Kurt found a doctor who prescribed him MS Contin, a long-acting morphine medication. On the surface, this seemed like an improvement. Instead of taking 65 Vicodin pills throughout the day, he was now taking just 2 morphine pills, one in the morning, one at night. The doctor's intention was likely to help manage Kurt's chronic pain from years of wrestling injuries while reducing the number of pills he needed to take. But morphine is still an opioid, and Kurt was still dependent.
I got my painkiller problem under control there because I found a doctor that got me on MS Contin. There are 2 morphine pills. They're very tiny, but they'll keep you from going through withdrawal. So I would take one in the morning, one at night, and no more painkillers.
Kurt convinced himself that this was under control. He was no longer taking massive quantities of Vicodin throughout the day. He was down to just 2 pills daily. By his own logic, this was progress. This was management. This was him getting his life together. But in reality, this was simply trading one form of opioid dependence for another. The underlying addiction hadn't been addressed at all. Then came the anxiety. Years of wrestling, of breaking his neck multiple times, of pushing his body beyond reasonable limits, had taken a psychological toll. Kurt began experiencing severe anxiety about wrestling, particularly about the very real possibility of breaking his neck yet again. Any reasonable person would have anxiety about this. His concerns were entirely rational given his injury history. So doctors prescribed him Xanax, a benzodiazepine used to treat anxiety disorders. Now Kurt was taking morphine for pain and Xanax for anxiety. But the nightmare wasn't complete yet. At Impact Wrestling, there was apparently a drinking culture among the performers, something that wasn't as prevalent during his time with WWE, and Kurt, already chemically dependent on multiple substances, added alcohol to the mix. This is where Kurt Angle's situation became immediately life-threatening, not just to himself but to others as well. Mixing opioids, benzodiazepines, and alcohol is one of the most dangerous drug combinations possible. Each of these substances is a central nervous system depressant, meaning they slow down breathing, heart rate, and other vital functions. When combined, their effects multiply exponentially, creating a synergistic effect that can easily lead to respiratory failure and death. Countless people die every year from this exact combination of substances. But Kurt wasn't just taking these substances and staying home. He was driving. 4 DUIs in 5 years. For those keeping track at home, that means Kurt Angle was arrested for driving under the influence approximately once every 15 months. And those were just the times he got caught. How many times did he drive impaired without being pulled over? How many times did he endanger not just his own life, but the lives of innocent people sharing the road with him? The statistics on impaired driving are sobering. Drunk drivers are involved in approximately 1/3 of all traffic fatalities in the United States. Kurt Angle, by his own admission, was one of those drunk drivers, operating a vehicle while under the influence of alcohol, opioids, and benzodiazepines. The public consequences were severe and immediate. Kurt Angle's reputation, built over decades of athletic achievement, from his Olympic gold medal to his championship runs in WWE, was shattered. The respect he'd earned, the legacy he'd built, the image of Kurt Angle as a role model and champion, all of it came crashing down as news of his repeated DUI arrests became public. But the private consequences were even more devastating. Kurt's wife had stood by him through his injuries, through his pain, through his addiction, through his denial. But 4 DUIs in 5 years was too much. When Kurt called her from from jail after his 4th arrest, she delivered her own ultimatum, one that would finally break through Kurt's denial and force him to confront the reality of his situation. This was it. This was Kurt Angle's rock-bottom moment. He'd lost his reputation, his career was in jeopardy, his health was destroyed, and now he was about to lose his family, the people who mattered most to him. Sometimes it takes losing everything, or the threat of losing everything, before an addict is finally ready to accept help. For Kurt, that moment came in a jail cell, hearing his wife tell him that she was done, that she couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore, that she had to protect herself and their children from the chaos and devastation of his addiction. So Kurt Angle finally went to rehab. Not because WWE wanted him to, not because doctors recommended it, but because the alternative, losing his wife and children, was finally more terrifying than the prospect of getting clean. Going through rehabilitation is terrifying under any circumstances, but for someone with Kurt Angle's level of dependence, it was particularly daunting. He'd been taking opioids for years. His body was physically dependent on these substances to function. Stopping them wasn't just difficult, it was going to be agonizing. The withdrawal process that Kurt experienced in rehab is something he describes as the worst thing he's ever been through. And this is coming from a man who broke his neck multiple times, who competed at the Olympic level, who endured countless injuries throughout his wrestling career. For 6 days, Kurt went through withdrawal symptoms in a room by himself, with medical staff checking on him periodically, but otherwise leaving him alone to endure the process. The physical symptoms of opioid withdrawal are brutal. Kurt describes experiencing simultaneous hot and cold sensations, sweating profusely, uncontrollable shaking, vomiting, diarrhea, and an inability to think clearly. But perhaps most disturbing was his description of feeling hollow, as if his internal organs had disappeared, leaving nothing but an empty shell. After the acute withdrawal phase ended, Kurt still faced weeks of recovery. For 2.5 weeks, he barely had the energy or motivation to get out of bed. The staff at the rehabilitation facility had to force him to engage with the program, to participate in group therapy, to eat meals, to start rebuilding his life. This fear of relapse is common among recovering addicts, and Kurt was no exception. The statistics on relapse are sobering. The majority of people who complete rehabilitation programs will relapse at least once. Kurt had heard these stories, knew these statistics, and was terrified that he would become another one of them.
I was scared that I was going to go back to it right when I got out.
So many guys do.
That's
crazy.
why.
But Kurt Angle had something powerful working in his favor, the memory of withdrawal. The experience had been so traumatic, so physically and psychologically devastating, that it served as a powerful deterrent against relapse.
That's
Crazy.
why, like, I hear all these stories, and I'm like, oh, it's going to happen to you too, man. And, but the one thing that I kept going across in my mind was going through withdrawal. I don't want to do that again. And I know if I start taking them, I'm going to have to experience that again, and I don't want to.
It was that bad.
It was that bad.
The pain of withdrawal became Kurt's shield against relapse. Every time he felt tempted, every time the cravings hit, every time life's stresses made him think about taking just one pill to take the edge off, he remembered those 6 days in rehab. He remembered the sweating, the shaking, the vomiting, the hollow feeling inside, and that memory was enough to keep him sober.
It's just the craziest thing. It's the most painful thing I've ever gone through. And, I'm sure people have been in a lot more pain than that with certain things they've had done to themselves. But for me, that was the worst.
Today, Kurt Angle is sober. He's been open about his struggles with addiction, using his platform and his story to help others who might be facing similar battles. He's mended his relationship with his family, rebuilt his reputation, and found peace after years of internal turmoil. His story isn't just one of tragedy, it's also one of redemption, of survival, of the possibility of recovery even from the depths of severe addiction. But Kurt's story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prescription painkillers, about how easily legitimate medical treatment can spiral into addiction, and about how the pressures of professional athletics can push people to make dangerous choices with their health. It's a reminder that addiction doesn't discriminate. It can affect Olympic gold medalists and wrestling champions just as easily as anyone else. Kurt Angle's greatest match wasn't against Brock Lesnar or any other opponent in a wrestling ring. It was against the pills that nearly destroyed him, the addiction that consumed years of his life, and the demons that almost cost him everything he held dear. And unlike so many others who face similar battles, Kurt Angle won. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.